Well, welcome to our final live presentation about the Tour du Mont Blanc, and thank you for joining us. My name is Marvin Faure, and I'm the founder and general manager of Alpine Cols, which is a group of cycling coaches based in the Alps. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about how to get your best result on the day of the Tour du Mont Blanc. I'll answer any questions at the end, but don't hesitate to send any questions to me by email at info@alpinecols.com. I'll reply to everybody as soon as I can. So let's remind ourselves of the route. It's often referred to as the toughest one-day sportive in the world. Suffice to say that it covers 330 kilometers and includes 8,300 meters of climbing. These are huge numbers and they command serious respect. Everybody starts in the dark at 5 o'clock, and unlike the guy in the photo, many will finish after after nightfall, perhaps having to do the descent from the Cormet de Roseland in the dark as well as the final climb. The cutoff time to finish is midnight, so all finishers take somewhere between 12 and 19 hours to finish. In a good year, the attrition rate is around 40%. It's of course higher if the weather is bad. The event is above all an endurance challenge, and although all participants are timed, there is no official classification and all finishers receive a well-deserved medal and certificate. It's really a challenge on three levels: mental, physical, and nutritional, and in that order. And the most likely reason to abandon is mental. For most first-timers, it'll be the toughest thing you've ever done, perhaps by some margin. At the halfway point, you'll have only ridden almost the equivalent of the Marmot, but it's still only halfway. To reach the finish, you'll likely push yourself to your limits and then have to go beyond. You can expect to experience highs and lows with moments of euphoria where you can't believe how strong you feel, followed by moments of despair when you can't believe how bad you feel. Many people think of quitting more than once, and those who've prepared properly can usually find the tenacity and determination they need to keep going. So having set the scene, but before we get into the details of the day itself, let's have a quick look at the final 2 weeks. There's now just over 2 weeks to go, and your goal should be to eliminate all fatigue before you get to the start line. It's not an exaggeration to say that you can throw away most of the benefits of your training if you don't get these last few days right. So first thing to do is to progressively reduce your training volume by at least 50%. So it doesn't mean from one day to the next, cut it in half, but progressively. So over this weekend, cut it down maybe by 20% or so, and then during the week by another 20%. So by next weekend, it's down to 50%. At the same time, you should be limiting the intensity. If you absolutely must do any high intensity, keep it short and sweet. Above all, you need to sleep well, eat well, stay supple, limit stress, and limit extra demands on you in your life in these last 2 weeks. Full recovery is much more valuable than nearly full, 95% recovery. At 95%, you might easily lose 20% of your performance potential over the last 2 climbs. And that could make all the difference between finishing and not finishing. So really the absolute focus of these last 2 weeks is to recover. Eliminate the fatigue. Yes, you've got to keep a little bit of training so you don't lose any fitness, but it's too late to add fitness. So don't push yourself too hard. It's just maintenance while eliminating fatigue that you're trying to achieve now. So with that said, now let's talk about the day itself. There are 3 essentials for a successful ride. First of all, pacing, especially on the climbs, then fueling, and finally mental. I already said that mental is the most important, so I'll come to that last. Let's talk about pacing first. But before we can do that, we need to clarify your objective, because your pacing strategy depends on it. Your objective on the Tour du Mont Blanc can really only be one of these 2. Either to ride the event as fast as possible, or simply to finish before the cutoff. Which of these objectives you choose for yourself leads to a slightly different pacing strategy. So we're going to look at each of them in turn. If your goal is to get a fast time, then you must ride as close as possible to your limits without going over them. You've got to be careful, however, because whereas on a normal sportive, the consequences of going over your limits are not too serious, on the Tour du Mont Blanc, it could quite easily mean that you can't finish. So you need to figure out what pace you can sustain over 157 kilometers of climbing. I'll show you how to do that in a couple of minutes. If your goal is simply to finish, you should work backwards from the official cutoff times at Bourg Saint-Maurice and the Comite de Rosalind and make sure you get there in time. I calculate that to stand a good chance of making these two cutoffs, you should be through the feed station at Les Valettes, which is at the foot of the Col de Champex, by 10 o'clock in the morning, which means an average speed for the first 110 kilometers of 22 kilometers per hour. You then need to be on the top of the Grand Saint-Bernard by 2 p.m. There is actually a cutoff at Les Valettes at 11 a.m. There's an official cutoff there, but I think you should be through well before then if you are to have a good chance of finishing. It's important to recognize that if your only goal is to finish, it makes no sense to try to beat these time limits by a large margin. The risk of doing that is you go too hard too early, and then you're unable to finish. So it's better to hold back, get there in front of the cutoffs, of course, or those recommended cutoffs, of course, but hold back nevertheless, and then you can finish relatively strong. So how do you know which pace is sustainable for you for 157 kilometers of climbing? You need to look at the evidence and not base it on hope. This is really a key point. Miracles don't happen very often, and it's unlikely you will be suddenly much stronger at the Tour du Mont Blanc than you were in training or at other events you may have done recently. So what evidence can you use to determine your pace? Well, the place to start is your power duration curve and your critical power, or your FDP. Here's a personal example from last year before I had an accident and lost a lot of fitness. My critical power was about 275 watts. So in theory, I would have been able to hold this for 50 to 60 minutes. However, that's not enough time to get up any of the long climbs on the Tour du Mont Blanc. And in any case, I wouldn't have been able to repeat it over and over again. So we have to look at other evidence to see what fraction of critical power or what fraction of FDP I might be able to climb at for 10 hours or more. So that's what we're going to do now. So let's see what I've done in previous long distance events with a lot of climbing, such as Liège-Bastogne-Liège, the Mallorca 312, some Sanglé rides on Mont Ventoux, the Marmotte, the Soncols Challenge in Corsica, and of course the Tour du Mont Blanc itself, which I rode last year over 2 days. So these gave me the real life data for the average power I was able to sustain on the climbs during these events. To make it relevant for you, you should pay more attention to the final column, the percent of critical power or percent of FDP, than to the actual power numbers. Note that the climbs on Liège-Bastogne-Liège are all short, and the climbs on the Mallorca 312 are mostly in the first half of the course, the second half of the course being largely flat and a few rolling hills. And that explains why the percent of critical power for those two events is relatively high compared to the others. The most useful data is in fact from the last two, the Soncols Corsica and the Tour du Mont Blanc over 2 days. The Soncols Corsica was a 10-day event during which I rode an average of 185 kilometers with almost 4,000 meters of climbing per day, 10 days in a row. And my average power on the climbs during that event was 180 watts, which was 65% of my critical power. I then did the Tour du Mont Blanc over 2 days. So the average power there varied between 64% and 67% of critical power. Now, the problem is, of course, that it's still a big step up and a leap into the unknown to go from a half Tour du Mont Blanc to the full distance. So what to do about that? The only thing I could do really is plan to be conservative. And so my plan was to target 60% of my critical power on the climbs. which for me at the time was 165 watts. Note that for you, the higher your critical power per kilogram, the higher your target percent of that critical power can be. Why? Simply because you will take less time on each climb. For reference, at the time, mine was about 3.9 watts per kilos. So if yours is significantly higher, let's say 4.2, 4.3 or more, then you might be able to sustain a slightly higher percentage of your critical power, again, because you'll be getting up the climbs quicker than I can. Whereas if yours, if your watts per kilo are significantly lower than 3.9, so lower than mine, let's say, I don't know, 3.5, 3.6, 3.7, somewhere around there, you should probably knock it down a little bit, and you should maybe target a little bit less in terms of percentage of critical power, because again, you'll be taking a bit longer on the climbs. So that was my plan for last year. I wasn't able to ride it because of the accident, but that's what I would have. So I can't tell you how it went, but that's what I would have done. Now, on the day itself, you may want to, at least you should think about making some adjustments to your theoretical target based upon several things. In particular, the weather. For example, if it's very hot, then your planned pace on the Grand Saint-Bernard and the Petit Saint-Bernard will probably have to come down a bit. Depending on your recent training, if you push too hard in your training, then you may be not fully recovered. The quality of your taper, the same. The levels of stress you might have been under, unfortunately, in the last 2 weeks, if you've had a huge amount of stress at work or at home for whatever reason, that is definitely going to affect your performance. So you're going to have to bring your target power down a little bit. Similarly, with the quality of sleep, if you've been unable to sleep well, it depends also on your motivation. Of course, if your motivation is very, very high, you can push it up a little bit. If it's not so high, you again probably need to bring it down. And of course, your general feel on the day. The biggest risk is going too hard on the early climbs. Most people make this mistake. It will feel like you're holding back, and it must feel like you're holding back on those early climbs. Believe me, it won't feel like holding back when you get to the later climbs. You'll be struggling to keep that power that you targeted. So let's look now at fueling. Whether you get this right or wrong will have a massive impact on your performance. This is really important. You're going to burn somewhere in the region of 8,000 to 10,000 calories during the Tour du Mont Blanc. There's no way to eat this much during the event. As a simple calculation will show you, a typical energy bar contains between 100 and 200 calories, so you'd need to eat at least 50 to replace those calories you're burning. So that's not going to happen. So it's obviously essential to start with a full tank. How do you do that? Well, eat plenty of carbs the week before, pasta, rice, potatoes, and any other carbs that you like. Compensate, you don't want to eat too many calories on the other hand, so compensate for those additional carbs by reducing the amount of fat that you eat. So cut down on anything that's fatty, whether it be oils or butter or fats, meat fats, or whatever it may be. As you get close to the event, eat normally on the Friday, neither a lot nor a little, just a normal meal on the Friday, the night before. Limiting fiber, because you obviously don't want too much fiber in your stomach. And then you want to eat a carb-heavy breakfast. And my recommendation is to go to bed as early as possible. You probably won't sleep very well. That's not a disaster for the final night. And you want to eat, you should eat again during the night. So at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and 4 o'clock, eat again. A good example, what I would have eaten would have been white rice and omelette at 2 o'clock, pre-made, of course. I'd be eating it cold. Gingerbread or cake at 3 o'clock, and maybe a couple of honey waffles at 4 o'clock. And of course, at 4 o'clock, I'd be on the point of getting up anyway, to be on the start line for 5. The amount you need depends upon how good a fat burner you are. The less your body burns fat when you're climbing, the more carbs you need to consume to compensate for that inability to burn fat. Of course, fat burning can be trained, but it's too late to do anything now. So it is what it is. Whatever your ability to burn fat is, it's not going to change between now and the event. So the actual amount of carbs you can consume during the event depend upon what you're used to doing in training. The recommendation is to consume between 60 grams of carbs per hour as a minimum, up to 100, which is probably a maximum for the Tour du Mont Blanc. But you will only be able to consume anything like 100 if you're used to doing that in training. If you're not even used to consuming 60 grams, there's no way you'll be able to consume more. So don't attempt to increase it dramatically on the day, but do see the target of 60 grams per hour as the minimum. You can see here the amount of carbohydrate in a bottle of energy drink, in a gel, an energy bar, or a banana. To keep things simple, they're all about 30 grams. So you need to consume at least 2 items per hour. The key is to do that little and often, and at least every 15 minutes. It's worth setting an alarm on your Garmin that will ring every 10 minutes or every 15 minutes to remind you. The important thing is never to drop behind, because you can't catch up. Here's the full list of feed stations with the details of what's available that the organization gave me yesterday, so this is up to date. My recommendation is that you should stop briefly at every feed station, all 7 of them, but bear in mind that 7 by 5 minutes would be 35 minutes stopped. So if there's any risk of you missing the cutoffs, keep your stops as short and efficient as possible. The only possible exception to not stopping, or to stopping rather, would be the first at Vaudagne, and that's only if it's a really cool day and you still have plenty of water when you reach Vaudagne. You can easily pick up water at some public water fountains on the way through Chamonix and up the valley, so you could skip that one, but again, only if it's a really cool day and you still have water with you. All right, so that's it for nutrition. Now let's take a look at the mental side. Remember I said at the beginning that the biggest challenge on the Tour du Mont Blanc is mental. So long as you've done the training and you eat and drink enough, the most likely reason to abandon is mental. For most people, this is going to be the longest, toughest day they've ever spent on the bike, and probably by a significant margin. So what can you do to prepare mentally for this? This quote is from one of the world's top experts in the mental side of endurance sports, Samuele Marcora, and it perfectly encapsulates the challenge. Endurance is the struggle to continue against a mounting desire to stop. I can practically guarantee that by the time you get to the Cormet de Roselaine and start up it, you will be experiencing a mounting desire to stop. You may already feel this, in fact, on the previous climb, the Pitti Saint-Bernard. So what can you do about it? Well, there are 2 ways to increase your mental strength and your ability to continue against this mounting desire to stop. The first is to increase your motivation. And the second is to reduce your perception of effort, to reduce how hard it feels. And in fact, you want to do both of them in parallel. Now, this is quite a complicated subject. We don't have time to go into in detail, but I'm going to give you a quick overview and then point you to where you can learn more, some resources. The key to increasing motivation is to have a clear set of goals that you need to think about in advance. And the first point is to have a good answer to the question, why am I doing this? You can be sure you're going to ask yourself this question probably many times. Okay, for me, in the example here, I wanted to prove to myself that I could do the full distance on the Mallorca 312. I'd never done anything like so much. I think I'd ridden once 250 kilometers, but not with anything like as much climbing. So to me, it was a real challenge, and I wanted to see if I could do it. That was why. Now, the second type of goal is an outcome goal, something like to finish or to finish in less than 15 hours. So the goal then is to do with an outcome. It's achieving something precise or specific. The important thing is to make sure it's realistic and achievable. So my only outcome goal was to finish, which I thought was probably realistic and achievable, and it turned out to be the case. Now, there's a third category of goals called process goals, which are basically things that can help you achieve the outcome. And they're things like stick to the plan, climb at 60% of your FDP, or eat 60 grams of carbohydrate every hour. So those are process goals. Those are things that if you remind yourself of them during the event and you succeed in doing those things during the event, that's going to help you to achieve your outcome goals. Now, still on the motivational side, when you go through a rough patch, which you're absolutely bound to, you may find some positive self-talk to be helpful. It's really important to be able to counter that seductive voice in your head that's saying something like, this is too hard. I'm not going to make it. I've had enough. Let's just stop here. Now, different things work for different people. So choose and adapt what works for you. I mean, maybe none of these examples I'm going to show you work for you. Find your own. So some examples might be, this is what I've been training for. This is why I'm here. So why would I stop? I'm so lucky to be here. Let's enjoy it. Other people couldn't possibly be here. They're not fit enough. They're not well enough. They're injured. They couldn't do it. I'm so lucky. So let's enjoy it. Let's do it. Keep pushing. Keep pushing. Just positively reminding yourself, push, push, push. You might tell yourself, you might look around and see other people's faces and say, well, everyone else is hurting at least as much as me, maybe even more than me. So if they can keep going, then so can I. You can say to yourself, well, look how far you've come. You're over halfway. So you've done the worst. Keep going. You're going to make it. Now, taking the event as a whole can be overwhelming. If you start to run into trouble early on in the event and you start thinking about everything that's to come, that can really be overwhelming. So it can be very helpful to break the whole event down into sections, climb by climb, and think about it just climb by climb, section by section. So when things get really bad, say to yourself, I can get to the top of this climb, and I'll worry about the rest when I get there. When I get to the top of this climb, there's a feed station, then I've got a descent, so I can relax, I can recover, and then we'll see where I am. And if it gets even worse than that, then tell yourself, well, I can get to the next corner. And when you get to that next corner, you look around and you can see the following corner. You say, okay, I can carry on, I can get to the next corner. You can always do another 100 meters. You can always do a little bit more. So positive self-talk is really important. You mustn't let a negative self-talk dominate in your mind. And once you start telling yourself you can't do it, well, that's the end. You can't. When you convince yourself you can't do it, you can't do it. It's as simple as that. Convince yourself you can do it, and you probably can. Another category of positive self-talk is instructional self-talk, where you tell yourself what to do. Examples might be things like this: stick to your own pace. Don't get sucked into trying to hang on to wheels of people who are stronger than you. So stick to your own pace. Pedal smoothly. Don't waste energy. Relax your shoulders. Again, those tense shoulders can be an awful waste of energy. And then when you're descending, remind yourself to look far around the corner so you're cornering fast and safely. And many other things you could tell yourself in an instructional sense. You're telling yourself how to ride more effectively. Last but not least, visualization and seeing yourself at the summit of the next climb, or even at the finish, certainly towards the end of the race, can be a powerful motivator and a really good reason to keep going. So visualization can also be very, very powerful. I wouldn't visualize myself at the finish right from the outset, because that's just too far away. But I certainly visualize myself at the next col, and then the one after that, and so on. So now let's talk about the second aspect of mental strength, which is how to reduce the feeling of effort, that perception of effort. This is really important, because the easier it feels, the longer you can keep going. And the contrary is true. The harder it feels, the less you can keep going. One of the best ways is to distract your mind from the feeling, which basically means thinking about something else. So here are a few examples of how to do that. You can relive a memory, take yourself away somewhere and just think about that at length. You can think about your future plans, project into the future. You can quite simply look around and enjoy the scenery and imagine what that means to you. You can focus very intently on the rider just in front, or on his rear wheel hub or something like that. You can count your pedal strokes, maybe in a foreign language to make it a little bit more difficult. You know, the more your brain is occupied by thinking about something else, the less space it has to think about the effort and how hard it is to keep turning the pedals. You can recite poetry, song lyrics or mantras or whatever comes to mind. And you can just let your mind, if you do meditation, just let your mind go blank and think of nothing at all. Here are several more tips for reducing the perceived effort. This is not a joke, but smile, quite literally forcing yourself to smile, even if it's totally mirthless and you don't feel anything funny at all. Forcing your mouth into a smile releases endorphins and makes you feel better. Research has proved that, and I've tested it for myself. I know for a fact that when I'm doing a hard set of intervals, if I'm almost at my limit and I'm almost about to give up, if I force myself to smile, I can keep going for a bit longer. Another thing you can do, of course, is to relax, especially your upper body and shoulders. That reduces the amount of stress hormones, cortisol, and so on that are being released, and because it makes you feel better, it'll release a little bit of the more positive hormones, the endorphins. You can take a caffeine gel, which has the same sort of effect. If you have a lucky charm, if you're one of the folks that believe that you have a lucky charm and it works for you, then take it, because if it works for you, then it works. And our old friend visualization, once again, in a slightly different context here, you can use to feel better. For example, if it's a wet day, it'll be almost certainly very cold going down off the Col du Grand Saint-Bernard, for example. And you may or may not have enough clothes. You may be very, very cold. And the only way you can survive that is to visualize yourself feeling warm. So you tell yourself, even though it's cold, there's no point in denying it, it's cold, right? But even though it's cold, I'm not feeling uncomfortable, because in my mind, I'm sitting in my living room and it's nice and warm. Or in my mind, I'm descending a col somewhere else in hot weather and it's just beautifully warm. Whatever works for you. But the point is to take yourself away from that in your mind, from that uncomfortable situation. You can also, if you're struggling on one of the climbs, you can visualize yourself pedaling really smoothly and powerfully, and that will help you to pick up again a smoother and more powerful pedal stroke. Well, the final part of mental preparation is contingency planning. It's well worth spending a few minutes doing this in advance. A lot of things could go wrong on your ride, but there's no reason why they should stop you finishing, so long as you have a decent plan to deal with them. Okay, so think all of these things through. Punctures are certainly possible, so make sure you've got what it takes to to change your inner tube twice, or to plug if you're running on tubeless tires, then you need a plug system. You need extra cartridges. So do the contingency planning for that, and make sure you know how to do the necessary. Think about what you're going to do if the weather's bad, the clothes you're going to take with you, how you're going to deal with that bad weather. The bad weather could be either wet, of course, or it could be very hot. Either ends of the extremes are problematic. Think about what you're going to do if you get dropped, if you find yourself on your own. Are you going to push hard and try and catch up, or are you just going to continue at your own pace? Strong hint, I recommend the last solution. Continue at your own pace, and you'll give yourself the best chance of finishing. What to do if you bonk, if you have a complete crash in nutritional terms, if you feel completely out of energy. Well, you must always have at least one emergency gel in your pocket that you can take. But again, think it through so you're ready for it if it happens. You recognize the symptoms as they're coming, and you can deal with them as they happen. What are you going to do if you feel sick? It's not unusual to start feeling sick after a long day of taking on an awful lot of sugary stuff. So you need to combat that with the right sort of more savory foods. And how are you going to deal with that? You may suffer cramps. How are you going to deal with them? You may feel dispirited. We talked about that earlier, of course, the need to have some positive thoughts ready, some positive mantras maybe. And so the more you do this contingency planning in advance, the stronger you'll be on the day. Now, that was a very quick run through what's a rather complex subject. You'll find more in our mental preparation guide, which is on the Tour du Mont Blanc website. You can see it there, ringed in red. You can find that on their website under the training program for alpine cols. Now, a word about clothing and personal equipment. Having inadequate clothing for the conditions is probably the fourth major reason for abandoning. Of course, it all depends on the weather, so it's essential to have a good understanding of the forecast around the whole course, and particularly on the highest cols. If it's going to be anything other than a heat wave, you'll need more than a simple summer jersey. Don't forget, you'll be starting at 5 o'clock in the morning with a long descent as the first part of the course. So the best solution is thin layers that are easily adaptable. Maybe arm warmers, a light jacket. You'll need perhaps a rain jacket, a gilet, perhaps long-fingered gloves, a cap or a bonnet, perhaps a neck warmer, perhaps leg warmers. It all depends, obviously, on the weather forecast. But there's potentially quite a lot of stuff that you need to bring with you if the weather's going to be bad. So how to carry it? This event is far more like an ultra event than a normal sportive. So don't be shy about using a saddlebag or a frame bag for bike packing. If you're only concerned about the start, you could perhaps wear a very cheap plastic jacket or some sort of thing that you can, even a bin bag that you can dump in a rubbish bin at the bottom. But otherwise, you carry the things with you on your bike. Two jerseys. Wearing two jerseys is an old trick because you then have 6 pockets, so that can be a good idea. And of course, a final option is just to tie things around your waist or to stuff them down your jersey, but that's not necessarily the most comfortable thing to do for a long ride. But let's conclude with the 5 top mistakes to avoid. The first one is no surprise, it's riding too hard on the early climbs. Second one is burning too many, or I would argue even any matches. So by that, the temptation, of course, is that the start is the descent from the Cézille, and then when you get to the bottom of the valley, there's a false flat climb with several bumps up and down to get to Megève, where we descend again. The group will be largely together, so there's a temptation to push hard to stay with people that are in front of you, and you could easily find yourself putting 300 or 350 watts to stay in the wheels. I strongly would discourage that. Much better just to go straight away into your own pace, because all you're going to save is a couple of minutes, and you're likely to, and you're going to compromise your ability to finish later on. Obviously, forgetting to eat and drink is a major mistake to avoid. Inadequate clothing we've just looked at. That's very important to make sure you've got the right clothing for whatever the forecast is. And finally, we haven't talked about this yet, but be very, very, very aware of your level of fatigue and your level of concentration when you're descending, particularly in the latter half of the event, as you're getting more and more tired. That's when it's easy to make mistakes. You're not necessarily taking risks knowingly, but because you're very fatigued, you might start braking too late, or you might misread the corner, and you could easily have an accident. So please take care on those descents. No silly risks, particularly towards the end. I'm going to conclude with 3 go faster tips. The first and most obvious is to have your bike in perfect condition. It would be really far too stupid to have an avoidable puncture or mechanical. So thorough check of your bike. If you've got the ability to do that yourself, great. Otherwise, have a mechanic do it for you. The second go faster tip is to be as efficient as possible while climbing. Remember, you've got 157 kilometers to climb, so you really need to be efficient and not waste energy. The tip here is to keep your upper body still and relaxed and focus all your energy into your legs. So you're driving from the hips down. From the hips up, nothing should be moving. A second tip while climbing is when it gets steep, drop your heels and lock your ankle down. That provides more power. And finally, stand up frequently at a lower cadence to avoid peaking your heart rate. So if your cadence while you're seated is, let's say, 75 RPM, when you stand up, you'd want to drop that to 60 or even 55. That's just to stop your heart rate from peaking. And the purpose of standing up is of course, now your whole weight is going onto the pedals with relatively little effort, and you're changing your muscle recruitment patterns, which gives the muscles in your legs a break. And when you sit down again, it will feel easier. So that's all about efficient climbing. Finally, while descending, don't forget to pedal downhill whenever it's safe to do so. I'm not suggesting you pedal downhill when you're already riding at 70 kilometers an hour and there's a corner coming up, obviously. But pedal downhill whenever it's safe to do so, because for very little energy, you get extra speed that's essentially free. And on top of that, and importantly, you keep your blood flowing, which avoids your legs stiffening up and perhaps causing cramps on the next climb. So that's arguably the most important reason for pedaling while descending, is to keep the blood flow. So that's it. If you follow the tips I've given you, you should be able to get your best possible result on the day. So good luck. If you found this helpful and would like to know more about what we do, please check out our website, www.alpinecols.com. We have a few places left on our trip to the beautiful island of Corsica in September. That really is absolutely exceptional. If you're interested in that, let me know. You can contact us anytime for one-on-one coaching. We work with people at every level and for events ranging from the Étape du Tour, the Marmont, Tour du Mont Blanc, the Grand Fondo World Championships, of course, as well as for triathlons. So we're happy to help. And thank you. It only remains for me to say thank you very much for listening, and good luck on the day.